Hi, I'm Danny Goldberg, and I am excited that my memoir, Bumping into Geniuses, is being reissued, and here to talk to you.
Hey Danny, great to have you on Moments That Rock. In your early years as a teenager, going to gigs, being a journalist, writing reviews, etc., and just basically a fan, did you ever envisage a time that you would enter into the music industry, never mind PR, management, running your own record labels, etc., etc.? You must have liked it because it lasted a while.
No, I didn't know there was an industry. I just was a fan. I knew there were the artists and the records, and sometimes I'd read on the liner notes there were other people's names, and I kind of wondered who they were. I particularly think of the Rolling Stones albums with Andrew Loog Oldham's liner notes. I was wondering, who is that guy? He must be cool. But I didn't understand how record companies were organized, or that there was such a thing as a trade magazine or PR or promotion or booking agents or anything. I just loved to get stoned with my friends and listen to music.
Excellent. Those are the days, eh? So looking back, a journalist, a writer, was that actually your first job? In the music industry as such?
The first job, I stumbled into it by accident. I had dropped out of college and wanted a job so I could get my own apartment. I loved my parents, but I didn't want to live with them, once I was 18 and didn't have to. And it was a clerical job that was advertised in the New York Times. It just said magazine, and it turned out to be Billboard, which is the then and now the main trade magazine for the music business. So in the U.S. So I just, I got that job, which was not a writing job. It was a clerical job where this was in the late 60s, before there were barcodes or computer scanners. And we would call, there were 6 of us that would call record stores around the country and ask them what was selling. And we had a top 10 list, and we had a checklist, and that raw material was then collated and it turned into the charts. So I didn't know there was such a thing as charts until I was in the chart department. But I soon found out that they were very important to the record companies and the people who work for the artists. And one time, James Brown himself called to find out what his chart position was, and the phones would ring on a Friday when we got the numbers, and I happened to pick it up, and he was on the phone. So I figured, wow, I've stumbled into something pretty cool if I'm talking to James Brown.
That's right, James Brown phoning you up. That's quite an endorsement. Just going back through the years about Led Zeppelin and stuff. I remember when I went to see them and going backstage. It was Robert Plant who actually came out on the stage, and he signed my poster, rolled it up, and then passed it back down and said, "Oh, it's not much good with just my autograph on it. Do you want the other guys to do it?" And I went backstage. The point being, I got to realise at an early stage what it was like to meet your heroes. And throughout my career, it was always good to kind of get people, backstage just to say hi, have their photograph taken with bands and stuff. But looking back on it, I mean, did you know a guy called Henry Smith? Henry was actually Jimmy Page's roadie back in the Yardbirds, worked with him a long time and everything. Had some great stories because Henry was on my podcast on here talking about his time with Zeppelin and things that he was doing, and especially Peter Grant and people. I just wondered, did you actually know Henry? I presume you knew Richard Cole, but did you know Henry Smith?
Superficially, I know his role with the band. I as a publicist, I had a narrow focus. I wasn't involved with any of the physical production or the logistics. I dealt mostly with Peter Grant. And among the band members, the one who was by far the most interested and available for interviews was Robert Plant. So he was the one I got the closest to. Jimmy would do them if they were important enough. And the other 2 guys really almost never talked to the press. And then, of course, Zeppelin's legendary road manager, Richard Cole. One had to deal with him if you were on tour. And Richard and I stayed friends up until his death. I write about it in the reissue of the book the last time I spoke to him. But so I knew those other names, but I don't remember.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He was going to write a book. I don't know if he's done it actually yet, but he was going to write a book on Zeppelin. I said to him, "You don't want to write about the sex, drugs and rock and roll. They invented it. Come up with some good stories." He told me an amazing story about one night on the road with Zeppelin. Henry didn't drink, and Peter Grant sent him out to get some champagne for these people who's entertaining. They said, I don't know what to get. He said he gives him £50, and that buys you a lot of champagne back in the 60s, obviously. So he goes into this off-licence liquor store, etc., and he says, I need 5 bottles of champagne. He goes back to the gig, gives them to Peter. Bonzo comes and guzzles an entire one. We're not talking about a bottle of beer, in one gulp. And that night, he had a gig, and he stood behind him. And picture this, he had one foot on the back of his stool and his hand on the back of his head, because every time Bonzo would lean forward, he would puke up on his drum kit. And the other story he told me was, in those days, with promoters and stuff, he would go backstage to get the money, because they would only go on stage before they got paid, because obviously people got ripped off and stuff and things like that. So he'd go into the promoter's office, and the guy would pull out the drawer and be a wad of cash and a gun on top of it. That was a great story. I'll never forget that. I'm sure there's plenty of Led Zeppelin stories, and they'll never die.
Well, a lot of managers worked on handshake deals. As a manager myself, 90% of the people I've represented, and everyone I work with these days, it's a handshake. It's hard to enforce a management agreement, and it is a service business. And as long as you're getting paid as you go, you know, I don't think you need a contract. It's a little different if you're starting an artist from nothing. But when Jimmy shook hands with Peter Grant, he was already quite prominent in the British rock world. He had been in the Yardbirds, you know, and he was prior to that, he was like I think the premier session guitarist in London. He's on hits by The Who, The Kinks, Dusty Springfield. So, you know, I met Peter at the same time, the day before I met the rest of the band, and then I met the band with him. And I say the rest of the band because he was virtually like a band member. I mean, economically, they split everything, the 5 of them, and he was so protective of them and so close. And he could be very, very intimidating. He was, first of all, physically very big. A former professional wrestler, over 300 pounds, and most of it muscle. And he had you know, Cockney background, knew a lot of British gangsters, and was not someone who was pleasant to deal with if he thought you were ripping off his band. But he was quite good to me. He really, I really am so grateful to him for giving me the chance, you know, when I was quite inexperienced, and then to work for them. First, I was hired. I was part of a PR company, and I was the young guy with long hair. And then after that first meeting, I was the one dealing with him. I was just 22 years old when I first met them. And then a year later, he hired me to work for them full time. So I found him, look, there was too much cocaine in those days, and he could be in a bad mood. He could be sometimes make decisions that I didn't agree with. But personally, he was great to me. And I you know, fortunately, I got to speak to him a few months before he died, and I was able to really, like, just formally thank him for what he had done for my career, because here it is, more than 50 years later, I'm still talking about Led Zeppelin and gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, indeed, the gift that keeps on giving. I heard actually that Led Zeppelin sell more records now to kids that weren't even born when they split up. I mean, the reality is that people, like nowadays, they're listening to their grandparents' records collections, never mind their parents'. I mean, the Zeppelin legacy will live forever.
Well, I don't know what it means to sell a record today. I mean, obviously, most people are listening by streaming. But there's no question that their body of work has endured. They're one of the iconic rock bands. And, you know, their older fans revered them in one way. And then there's a certain percentage of younger people who are interested in what they call classic rock. And the minute you're in that genre, you're going to bump into Zeppelin right away. They're one of the top 5.
Yeah, and I think they always will be. I love the way they went about things. I mean, they didn't release singles because Peter Grant's philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, was the fact that, well, why do we want to release singles when we can sell albums? And people in those days did go out and buy albums, and Zeppelin sold a phenomenal amount of albums. And Peter Grant actually changed the goalposts as well when it came to touring. He would make more money for the artists than they'd ever done before, and that resonated with other people, and it changed the business model.
Yes. Yeah, I think Jimmy had a lot to do with that too. I mean, Jimmy Page was so involved in all those. Yeah, there was a I don't know what it was like exactly in the UK, but in the US there was a big psychological difference between singles artists and album artists. There were these new radio stations that had come along right at the end of the 1960s, just as Zeppelin put out their first album, that played, album cuts, and that's where all the people who went to concerts listened to, and they would play several songs from an album, not just the most popular songs. And so there was an image decision also in terms of the bands wanting to be part of the pantheon of this, what was then a new rock and roll, not the pop side. And yeah, I think they figured they could sell albums. I know they did put out a single in the U.S. on the very first album, Good Times, Bad Times. But I think after that, and that album exploded so quickly and ended up being better known for some other songs, I don't think they put out too many singles. By the time I was working with them, starting with the fifth album, Houses of the Holy, they were definitely not singles. They would still release songs, to the radio stations. But their biggest song, to this day, one of the biggest songs ever that rock and roll produced, Stairway to Heaven, was too long to be a single. And it didn't need to, they never would agree to edit it or shorten it because these rock stations played it. I mean, it was for 20 or 30 years the most played song on the radio in the U.S. and I think in many other parts of the world. So they saw themselves as an album artist. Jimmy, as a producer, really envisioned people listening to the whole album, and that was just what the culture kind of wanted at that moment in time. They came along a few years after the Beatles and the Stones. The Beatles and the Stones and the Who all did have singles, and God knows Zeppelin would be the first to acknowledge that they were great artists. But Zeppelin came along a little later. That next generation that appeared after the sort of San Francisco groups, after Woodstock. And to be an album artist was this prestigious thing to the big fan base.
It was, without any question of it. I mean, looking back on those times, I mean, it was completely different for artists and how they emerged authentically by the way they wanted to do things with the right management and stuff. But also, I think there was radio stations that played a big part. I mean, I interviewed Danny McNamara, who was the program director at WLIR in Long Island. And they were the first station to play The Alarm, Billy Idol, U2 actually, were the first station. When a lot of stations were playing safe with AOR and stuff like that, they were out front and took chances. And they weren't like actually in New York or LA or in big music cities. It was in like Long Island, and they were pioneers.
WLIR was one of those rock stations that I was talking about. They played albums and album cuts. They were the Long Island. Long Island obviously, is not part of the New York City radio market. And they had their own radio stations. And LAR, if you lived on Long Island and you loved rock and roll, that's what you listened to. You didn't want to listen to the top 40 station and just hear the pop hits. You wanted to hear, songs from the Hendrix album and maybe not Foxy Lady, maybe some of the other songs.
I don't know if you ever saw it. There's a great film about WILR and all the bands that they played. I interviewed Dennis McNamara from WLR, like I said. And did you ever see it?
It doesn't ring a bell.
It's really good, actually. I interviewed Ellen Goldfarb, who was the director, and she came to St. Petersburg, where I was living. They did a talk about it, and it's all about the bands that they played, and they interviewed Dennis McNamara and everybody else. You should go check it out.
Right. I don't know that I saw that. There's been a few. There's one about the Boston equivalent, WBCN, that I've seen. I don't think I saw the WLIR one. I don't think I did.
I mean, there's no amount of time we could spend talking about Led Zeppelin, but I wanted to talk a bit about Ahmet Ertegun and what a kind of legend he was in the music industry, ran Atlantic Records and stuff. I presume that was before your time. Well, not before your time, but, before you ran your label. But I heard a story that he signed them within 15 minutes of meeting them. Is that right?
Well, it was Jerry Wexler actually signed them. Jerry, Atlantic Records in the golden era, Ahmet and his brother Nesui were the primary owners, but there was a third partner, Jerry Wexler, who's it was my idol when I first started in the business, and he was the one who definitely produced the great Aretha Franklin records and Wilson Pickett and a lot of the R&B. And he signed Led Zeppelin because Dusty Springfield told him, Jimmy Page's new group is great. You should sign them. And he just had enough confidence in her judgment to just sign them. But once they were on the label, they ended up, and they exploded in popularity very quickly. They ended up becoming much closer to Ahmet Ertegun. Ahmet was more comfortable in the rock and roll culture. He became very good friends with Mick Jagger as well, and had this elegance. And Jerry Wexler was kind of an R&B purist so although Jerry did sign them, later on when I'd go to Led Zeppelin concerts, Ahmet was the one who would come to the New York and LA shows, and who when they renegotiated their deal, they would deal with them.
Am I right in thinking that Ahmet Ertegun collapsed and died actually at a gig?
He died as a result of a fall he took at a Rolling Stones gig. He was well into his 80s. I think he fell down and hit his head and never woke up, So I don't think he died at the gig. I think they took him to a hospital and he died there. But it had a poetic appropriateness to it because he was just such the consummate music man.
I have another story about that, actually. I'm sure that they actually reformed for the Ahmet Ertegun Foundation after his death, the only time they actually reformed. And obviously Bonzo was dead by then as well. But Jason stood in for him. And, the internet went down for the amount of tickets. People were coming from Japan and everything.
Zeppelin reformed for one show for some charity that was associated with Ahmet. Jason played drums. I was in London. I think it was at the O2. I was fortunate enough to go to that show. It had been a long time since I'd worked for the band, but they were nice enough to arrange tickets for me. And it was a good show. Jimmy was in great form. There was only one John Bonham. Jason could copy his dad, but he didn't have the creative brilliance of his dad to create some of those sounds and ideas. But he lived up to it for that moment, for sure. And Jimmy was in great form. And Robert Plant's almost always good.
Actually, the internet apparently went down. There were that many people, like I said, that were coming from Japan and all over the world to see Led Zeppelin because they never, ever thought it would happen.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I think they had more private airplanes to throw than any other time or something like that. It was, look, they were offered, I've heard, $1 billion for a world tour. Robert won't do it. The other guys, from what I've heard, would love to do it. But Robert, really doesn't need to do it. He's done incredibly well. And he's won Grammys and, can tour anytime he wants. And I think he liked being liberated. He was always kind of number two in Zeppelin. Jimmy was number one. In his own career, of course, he's number one. And the lead singer has that advantage. I asked him, wow, you've done so much better than the other ones. And he said, yeah, well, it's easier for a lead singer. People know the voice. But I don't see Mick Jagger or Roger Daltrey, having had that kind of solo success.
Yeah.
Robert really is in a very rarefied category that way.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, the singer you always expect to be kind of number one, but Page was such a legend even before that, doing sessions, I think, at 15, 16. And I'll share another quick story with you, Danny, about Zeppelin from our friend Henry. Henry the Horse Smith is referred to in Richard's book, actually. And after that gig, I remember talking to Henry about it, and he said that, he got a phone call on a Wednesday night or something, and it's like, phone goes, he picks it up, he goes, Henry. He goes, yeah. He says, it's Jimmy. I said, Jimmy who? He said, Jimmy fucking Page. And long story short, was Jimmy Page called Henry to invite him to go to the show at the O2 in London, which was amazing. So he goes to the show, then he comes back, Henry that is, and I don't hear anything from him. So I phone him up on a Wednesday night about 9 o'clock. I go, well? He says, well, what? I said, what was it like? He said, Tony, and there's this pause, he said, I've never heard Jimmy Page play like that in my life. And you think how many gigs that guy had been to and seen Jimmy Page perform. But I mean, back in those days, they were all off their faces, same with Eric Clapton and stuff. They would literally be propped up against their PAs, against their Marshall stacks. Play great, but this, Jimmy Page cleaned up and kind of an elderly gentleman and playing his ass off. So I heard that and it was pretty amazing. I wish I could have gone. But that was then, this is now.
Yeah. Well, that's how I felt. He was on fire that night. It was really, I think certainly physically very healthy. And knew it was this one time. I think they knew that that might be the last time that there was a Zeppelin, and in fact, it was the last time. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. And there must have been there was a section I was in. There must have been at least 100 or more people from the music business, cynical people, heads of William Morris, and managers, people who've been around for a while, and we were all like little kids afterwards. It was just wow. This was really it really was a Led Zeppelin show. It wasn't just a tribute to a Led Zeppelin show.
Exactly. Those of us that didn't get to go can only think. But you're right. I mean, like we said before, Danny, I mean, they were kind of through that drug period. I mean, every night they went out and they were kind of on another planet. I mean, they were good musicians and stuff, but nothing like they perform now. And, to have seen that and to have people who, like yourself and Henry, who'd worked with them and seen them so many times, come out with comments like that is just phenomenal. You can only imagine. Well, at least I can.
Yes, well, some people died from drug abuse, and other people stopped doing it. Those are sort of the two choices. So, and I think some people, there's a lot of people that are well into their 80s that are touring very effectively. I mean, obviously, Mick Jagger after a heart attack, just physically amazing. But, Bob Dylan well into his 80s, and Willie Nelson in his early 90s, and, Roberts, late 70s, he's out there working. I mean, it's an interesting culture because it was first known for people dying young, the tragic early deaths of Hendrix and Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, John Bonham, and obviously Kurt Cobain, and many other people. People who did survive. It's very inspiring. There's quite a few people well into their late 70s and 80s, not only touring but really doing good creative work. So they've kind of been an inspiration all over again to people of my generation.
Yeah, well, you could add David Bowie to the list of survivors there, Danny. I mean, who does what he did? He waited 10 years for one hit, Space Oddity. And then Ziggy Stardust exploded in the 70s and then killed it off in its prime. I mean, who does that? They wait for that amount of time for success. And then, of course, we wouldn't be talking about him now. He'd have been part of the 27 Club if he hadn't have kicked in his heroin habit. And that's why he is who he is today. Incredible survivor, musically, as well as killing off his addiction.
David Bowie is did what Bob Dylan did, which was completely challenging his audience and saying, look, I'm not going to keep copying myself. And it's a very rare artist who can pull that off. And Bowie, who I never met, but who I put on the highest level of the pantheon of geniuses. Incredible artist, incredible body of work. And even his last album, which I think he knew he was dying when he made it.
Absolutely. Only a few people did. His wife, Iman, did, and Tony Visconti. I think maybe one or two other people, if that. Not his band or anything. And I think, to be honest, I don't think he died until he'd finished his album. He refused to die. He orchestrated his death in the same way he orchestrated his life and his career. Astonishing.
It was a fantastic album, same as Leonard Cohen's last album, And of course, I had one of the chapters in the book is about Warren Zevon, who died younger because he died of cancer. But he made his last album when he knew he was dying. I was the label. I agreed to pay for a session for him to do 2 songs because we thought he wouldn't last long enough, and he ended up lasting long enough to do an album that ended up being one of his most successful albums and his only Grammy-winning album.
Yeah, I used to like Warren Zevon, and I actually interviewed Anita Gevinson on one of my podcasts who went out with Warren Zevon for quite a long time, on and off, I think.
Yeah, Anita was one of his girlfriends. Before I worked with him, but I like Anita. I know her. And they stayed friendly, Yeah,
one thing I did want to get to, Danny, before we finished, was reading the book. You said the greatest artist you ever worked with was Kurt Cobain. I thought Kurt was great and everything, but considering the people you work with, that was quite a statement.
Yeah. Well, look, he played the lead guitar and he was the lead singer. He wrote the lyrics and the music. So one person in that band did everything that it took Jimmy Page and Robert Plant or Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to do in their band. So let's just start with that. He also designed the album covers. He storyboarded the videos, and he made all of the decisions about the band's career. So I do think that puts him in my experience. I'm not saying there haven't been other people that have been as brilliant. I mean, obviously, Bob Dylan. I'm a great, fan of Bob Dylan, and younger people would look at Taylor Swift, and there's been some amazing. You look at Springsteen's career, but in my experience, Kurt was just the most creative and brilliant artist that I got to work with up close. I mean, I work with other very talented people, Stevie Nicks and Zevon and Zeppelin, and I've worked with Steve Earle for the last 25 years. So, but Kurt was to me on a peak of creativity, all of his own, in terms of just how he had such a unique vision. He really reinvented rock and roll. I mean, there's sort of before Nirvana and after Nirvana in terms of the kind of records that could get played on certain radio stations or videos and all that. And so in terms of my personal experience, he had a level of 24/7 brilliance that exceeded even the other people I worked with.
Yeah, after I read that in your book about Kurt Cobain, I went to his Wikipedia page, and what a dreadful upbringing, and his abusive father. It was really awful for him, wasn't it, growing up?
Yeah. He stayed in touch with his mother. She would come to some shows, Wendy. He was totally estranged from his father. The only time I ever met his father was at Kurt's funeral. And I think a lot of his... I think he felt his mother... He knew his mother loved him and encouraged his creativity. I think he felt she didn't always stand up for him. But he was very angry at his father. I obviously didn't know him when he was growing up, but no question that he bore wounds from that was part of who he was,
Yeah, and your book gets titled Bumping into Geniuses, but let's face it, Danny, there's a whole bunch of them that basically have demons inside.
It's a weird one, yeah. There's a lot of them. You read about Bruce Springsteen's battles with depression and John Lennon, and not everybody who's had an extraordinary career, troubled childhood, but a disproportionate percentage of them do. Kills some people, and other people it just drives them to do amazing things.
Before we go, Danny, and I'd love to invite you back at a later date whenever you want to finish all this off, because there's plenty more to talk about, especially when I've finished reading the book. But Bruce Springsteen we haven't mentioned, and Bruce is an amazing character. I met him very briefly once after the River Tour, when he sent the E Street Band back to the States and stayed behind to watch U2 play at the Hammersmith Palais. Went backstage and met him and everything. Really personable guy and everything, and he just comes over as like the complete rock star because he has empathy and he writes songs about things that he believes in and stuff, etc., etc. So, over to you, sir.
I certainly don't know him as well as I knew the people that I've personally managed or worked with closely when I was a record company guy, but I have met him on a number of occasions, starting with when we did a movie. I co-directed and co-produced a movie called No Nukes, 1980, that he was the star of, and he was in the editing room a lot, and in those days editing, there was no computer editing in those days. It was physical film, so it took hours. And then I met him many times over the years. He's got a very good relationship with Steve Earle, who I have worked with for the last quarter of a century, and did a benefit for Steve's son's school, and they're in touch. I mean, I talked to Steve over the weekend. He'd been just texting and back and forth with Bruce, and there's no bad stories about Bruce Springsteen in the musical community. He's generous to other artists. He's socially conscious, and he's personally unpretentious. He's a control freak. It's his, he's the boss. Why that's his nickname of what he does professionally. But he's really hard to think of a more admirable career of a public person in my lifetime. And he's doing it now. I mean, he's going back out on the road. I know the shows will be great, and he's taking this very principled and uncompromising stand against what's happening with this administration of the American government. More articulate and eloquent and outspoken than a lot of politicians whose job it is to say some of these things. But there's hundreds of stories of him being kind to other artists, singing on their records, bringing them on stage, watching their shows. He's who you want him to be.
I'll just quickly throw this in before we go, Danny. There's that story in the Walter Yetnikoff book, Howling at the Moon, where Springsteen brought in Nebraska to play him, and Yetnikoff told him that it wouldn't sell as well as his previous albums. I don't know, you probably do know about this and everything, but it was very interesting because I was very impressed by the fact that the chairman of the record company allowed an artist to indulge creatively and make an album that he had to make, because obviously he had severe bouts of depression and stuff going through his career and his life.
It was Born to Run, then Darkness on the Edge of Town, yeah. and then The River. And in between The River and Born in the USA, he puts out Nebraska. And that's what this recent movie, Deliver Me From Nowhere, is about. I thought it was a terrific movie. It didn't do as well as the conventional rock biopics like the Queen movie or even the Dylan movie. But artistically, I actually think it's a better movie. I think it's really, and it captures the making of Nebraska, which coincided with the Depression. It's a very slow, arty movie, but the movie shows that too. No question. I mean, Columbia Records was bummed out. They weren't getting a follow up to Darkness on the Edge of Town and The River. But it actually sold pretty well, given the fact that there was no singles on it, no videos. Didn't have a press campaign. It was just his fan base was strong enough. It's one of my favorite of Bruce's records. Not his biggest record, but I think it's just a brilliant, brilliant record.
I don't know the guy Yetnikoff, you probably do, but I do give him respect and for allowing an artist to indulge in something that he had to do creatively rather than just look at the bank and satisfy the shareholders, etc.
Well, after you've made millions of dollars in money for a label, they're going to let you indulge. It wasn't that big a sacrifice. I mean, this is also, I always got along very well with Walter Yetnikoff, but he is the guy that refused to release the Leonard Cohen album with Hallelujah on it. There's a documentary called Hallelujah that's quite good about Leonard Cohen. I think it's the best of the Leonard Cohen documentaries, and it has that story in it with, it's a historical fact. So, but, all the record companies, when you have a major artist who's made you a lot of money and they want to do something that's not that commercial, everybody learned their lesson from the argument that Neil Young had with David Geffen. When Neil Young at a certain point delivered some electronic sounding non-traditional Neil Young albums to Geffen, and Geffen tried to claim that he was in violation of his contract. Neil Young won that argument, and that ended the idea of such arguments forever. Because if David Geffen couldn't win an argument, that meant no record executive could win that particular argument.
Speaking of music industry books, Danny, did you ever read a book called The Hitmen?
I did read Hitmen by Fred Dann, and I got to know him a little bit. He did some stories about the Warner Music Group when I was there that were in the, I think they were in the New Yorker, either New Yorker or Vanity Fair. Anyway, he wrote about me favorably, so I like that about him. I thought Hitmen was a distorted view of the record business. I think it had a truth in it, which is that there were independent promotion people who were essentially middlemen for bribing radio stations. The so-called payola laws are pretty weak. It's not like stealing or killing somebody or blackmailing someone. Very, very few, if any, prosecutions for payola over the years, and they were able to circumvent it. But it was a sleazy part of the business. It was affiliated. Some of the guys were affiliated with organized crime, and they made enormous sums of money for just kind of being middlemen, But and it had an unsavory quality to it. But it was applied just to pop radio, to hit singles. Those guys, the so-called indies, so in that book you would never know there was such a thing as a Led Zeppelin that became the biggest band in the world without having hit singles. So I thought it sort of took 20% of the record business and made it look like 100%. So I always disliked that book for that reason, because I thought it trivialized the business. I'm a romantic about rock and roll and about the business, but it's part of the canon of books about the music business, and it's not that it's untrue as much as it just leaves out so much about the context. It obsesses on one aspect. Of course, by the time Money for Nothing came out, I mean, MTV was the dominant connector. That's even a song that mentions MTV, I think. Yeah, for the top 40 radio stations were influenced by this group of independent promotion people who would only work if you paid them money, and it was typically record companies that paid that money. That was one of the biggest part of the record company's marketing for artists that wanted to have pop hits. There's no question that was a real thing. It gave a big advantage to the people who had a couple $100,000 to pay those guys. And it was it didn't make any of us feel very good that was part of how you had a hit. But there were a lot of people in the history of music that had influence over music, whether it's the mafia in the 1940s. You look at Amadeus, where Mozart had to suck up to some duke or prince in order to get his music funded. Musicians are like hermit crabs. They find a home in different eras.
That's amazing stuff, Danny. So interesting to hear those stories, and certainly about the music industry from an insider's perspective. But I just wanted to share one story with you that is hilarious, actually. I would presume you knew a gentleman by the name of Les Garland.
Oh, I love Les Garland. Yeah. One of my favorite people.
Yeah, well, I must share this with you, a great story. Les came up with the idea of, I want my MTV and everything like that. He got the police in to do it and stuff. Anyway, he was friendly with Mick Jagger, so he flew out to France to meet him in Paris. They met for a coffee, sit down at a table. And we all know Mick Jagger as the singer with the Rolling Stones, but he's also London School of Economics, so he's a great businessman. He basically manages the Stones' business side of affairs and things. So he tells him about the jingle. He wants Mick to do it. He says, so Mick leans across and says, what kind of money are we talking about here, Les? And Les leans forward, sips on his coffee and says, I'll give you £1. And Jagger says, I'll do it.
Well, that's a part of being smart, is understanding sometimes media exposure is better than money. It makes you a lot of other money. And the Stones certainly adapted decade after decade to whatever the business needed. Incredible longevity to that career.
Well, Mr. Danny Goldberg, sir, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. It could have been gone on for a month, this, but I thoroughly enjoyed the stories and the lessons learned from rock and roll. So just to remind everybody, the book is called, it's a remix, so to speak, it's called Bumping Into Geniuses, and it's an absolute must-read if you're into music. And basically, you're into the best bands that ever came out of music. So thank you so much, Danny.
Yeah, it's the original book, but I added 10,000 words to it to update it. It was published in 2008, so for 2026, I wanted to update it. And I talked to some Springsteen and Bonnie Raitt and some of the artists just so I could see that period through the lens of 2026 instead of 28. Thanks, man.
Well, if you enjoyed that half as much as I did, you were well satisfied. Danny Goldberg again. And now you can source my podcast on my website, www.tonymichaelidis.com, which will take you to my YouTube channel, Moments That Rock by Tony. Subscribe, listen to it, and come back for more. Thank you very much. This has been Moments That Rock.